Now, that is the proactive side. Sometimes things fall apart. Sometimes employees don't do what they ought to do, and there are problems. And our job, I think, is to watch for the trends to see if things, where they're headed. But if we have performance problems, it's just like this ship. It's not going to get right side up on its own, most likely. So sometimes what I've seen with managers is a hesitancy to jump in and start dealing with things. And ignoring it oftentimes just isn't going to make the situation better. So let's talk about a few different things. This is an important legal concept, employment at will. I think there's only one state that doesn't follow this, and I think it's Montana. But the concept of employment at will is that an employee can come in and they can quit their job anytime for any reason without notice. And the employer has the same right in most cases. There are some exceptions to that, which we'll talk about. But be careful. Sometimes, say for example, someone is a member of a protected class. We need to be careful that we're not firing them for those reasons. So people frequently want to know why they are fired. Here's what I would suggest you do. Now, people who have a union contract typically have a just cause protection in that contract. So we can't terminate them without cause. Now, this idea of cause, make sure you don't promise this to your non-union people. But this is the thought process that I would like you to go through if you're wanting to terminate someone. And it's all reasonable. First of all, does the employee understand you have a rule? So do you have an employee handbook? Did you train them? Do you have orientation and onboarding? So do people know what the rules are, what the expectations are, so they're not blindsided? Number two, did they know that there are consequences for this? That if you break this rule, that you could be fired? Do people know, or that there could be other kind of discipline? Does your rule make sense? If someone from the outside was told about your rule, would it seem arbitrary and capricious? Or is it, yeah, it makes sense. It makes sense that you expect people to show up for work on time. It makes sense that people don't gamble at work, or that people don't steal your stuff. That all makes sense. Okay. So then, do you have a smoking gun? Do you have objective evidence that whoever did what you think they did? Now, sometimes that isn't possible. It's great, though, that if you have real clear evidence, you can prove that somebody broke the rule. And then, was your action reasonable? So, do you have a person who is a 20-year employee? We look back at all their performance appraisals. They've been a great employee. They were employee of the year. And then they do some little thing like park in the CEO's parking spot and they get fired. That doesn't smell right to most people. So is it consistent with their offense? Was it appropriate with their record? And was it consistent with past actions? If you have a policy that if you steal one time, you are gone, and you always do that regardless of what it is they steal, you're probably fine with that. But if one person steals 5 things, another person steals 1 thing, and you do it differently, you want consistency. So this is the thought process that you should work through. An employee should never be surprised, or very rarely be surprised, that they're being terminated. But do not promise this, because if you promise it, it takes away this concept of employment at will. And again, employment at will says that you can fire them at any time for any reason. But your employees may hold you to a standard. It needs to make sense to people. That's another way to look at this, is if you tell somebody else about this situation, will it make sense to them? Because ultimately what you're trying to do is be fair to employees and also keep your company out of trouble. Hopefully that makes sense. So then this other thing is this concept of progressive discipline. So typically you want to do what you need to do in order to make the change, and no more. It's not about punishing people, it's about changing behavior. So many times we're going to go through these different steps. So we're just going to talk to people. We're going to clarify expectations, make sure that they understand what you're looking for. But then you can have these other kinds of warnings, oral warnings, written warnings, suspensions, and ultimately termination. You don't need to necessarily follow all of these. Sometimes it really is 1 strike, you're out. Other times maybe it's 5 strikes and you're out. But you get to decide, and you need to make sure that in your handbook that you don't tie yourself down. This, again, is one of those things you don't necessarily promise that you're going to have these individual steps. Usually handbooks will say, we may do these things, but it's in the discretion of the company. Because if you promise you're going to do that, again, that negates this employment at will. But what we're just trying to do is be reasonable, fair, appropriate, and help our employees be successful. So if you have an employee with behavioral or performance kinds of problems, here's the steps you go through. And it's very much like giving people praise. First of all, if there's an issue, you deal with it as quickly as you reasonably can, as soon as you are ready. You don't want to jump the gun. You need to maybe do some investigation, but you don't want to wait around too long either. Especially if it's not a big deal, then you just sit and talk to the person kind of quickly so they understand that it's important. Then what we're going to do is we're going to make sure that there's clear expectations. We have a rule. Our expectation is that you are at work at 8 o'clock, ready to go on time. That's our expectation. Then we're going to define their performance. In your case, you've been late to work 3 times this week, and you weren't ready to go until 10 minutes after the hour. Okay, so we're saying, here's what we expect, here's what we got. And that there is a difference. There's a difference between the two. There's a gap. Our job, and it's not easy as managers, is to not be personal about these things. It's just as objective as we possibly can. Now keep in mind, it's pretty personal to the employee, so we always want to be diplomatic. We always want to be respectful, take the high road. Then what we do is we ask them for agreement to change. So here's what we expect, here's what we got. Do you agree to change? And I actually have them say that. Okay, what do you agree to do here? Okay. And then, we affirm their ability to change. We give them whatever resources we reasonably can to help them be successful.